guys, I'm going to be showing you guys how to make your very first loaf of bread or boule today. So some tools that you're going to need before starting out. One, a glass bowl or ceramic bowl. You can use stainless steel if you want, but I prefer glass because you can see the fermentation bubbles and how well it's proofing. So before we get started, here are a couple tools you want to have in your kitchen beforehand. First is a dough whisk. You can get a fancy looking one like this, but personally, I think it's a little bit overrated. The only reason there isn't really a purpose to this shape and design other than it's for mixing flour together, flour and water or flour and liquids. If you don't have one of this, that's okay. You don't have to splurge on this. A metal or wooden spoon works just fine, or even something as simple as a pastry cutter works just fine as well. Another thing you're going to want to have is a bench scraper. This can be used for scraping alongside the dough, lifting it up off the counter, cutting bread as well, or cutting your dough when you're doing your cooking. And there's just a lot of uses to this, and it is super handy. There's a lot of simple ones out there. You don't need a fancy one, but any kind of bench scraper is fine. You can get a stainless steel one. These are nice for scraping countertops. And there are also silicone ones that you can get as well that you can use for scraping around the bowl. Whatever you prefer, whatever your preference, it is totally up to you. For boules, the one thing that makes boules stand out, B-O-U-L-E, as opposed to regular sandwich sourdough bread, one is the ingredients that are in it. Sandwich sourdough bread contains the additional ingredients of oil and sugar, whereas the boule, or an old-fashioned artisan loaf of sourdough, here's an example of one here that I made yesterday. They only have 3 ingredients, and that is simply flour, salt, and water, in addition to your sourdough starter. People love making boules because, of course, you can score pretty designs on them, and the way you do that is with a sharp razor or a bread lane. If you don't have a bread lane like this one, and if you plan on doing a lot of baking boules and cutting and scoring designs, definitely invest in one of these. All it is a very sharp razor blade. Usually it comes with a handle or with a wooden handle. Some are round like this one. You can get other long-handled ones that have a handle similar to like this. But as long as you have a very sharp blade, and you usually want to swap out your blade after, I want to say 10 or so cuts or 10 or so boules of bread that you've cut into, because the sharper the razor blade, the better score and design in your loaf you will have. If you don't have one of these, a regular knife is fine, or even just a utility knife works just as fine. Or even just a utility knife or razor blade works fine as well. As long as it's clean. This one has a little bit of flour on it, but all I use it for is cutting bread, so it's fine. All right, other things to have in your kitchen, and it's okay if you don't have, but if you plan on doing a lot of bread baking, I highly recommend investing in these, and these are bannetons. All they are proofing baskets for your bread to sit in. Some of them will come, a lot of proofing baskets will come with a linen cover like this, and that helps the bread not stick to the banneton basket. If you don't use a linen cover, you want to make sure you flour it really well, as you can see in this one here. This one, I use rice flour to flour my bannetons. One, because it makes the design stand out, and because rice flour is not gluten, or doesn't have any gluten in it, it will not get soaked up by my boule or by my dough. So, same with this one. Make sure they are well floured. You don't have to clean them. You can like season them, kind of like cast iron. Season them with flour, and they will become less sticky over time. That is just bread crust. But if these, for some reason, if dough gets in them and stuck in all the cracks, and you try and clean it out, the best way to clean it out is to scrub it with warm water and let it dry completely. You don't want to put it in the oven because then you might warp it, but you want to let it dry completely to where there's no more moisture in it. And it's up to you whether you keep the linen covers on your bowl, or you can take them out if you like the traditional artisan bread texture. All right, other things you're going to need when starting out with sourdough is a food scale, because you want to measure out your ingredients in grams, and it is very important that we do that because it is a lot easier to be consistent with grams and convert recipes in grams with sizing up or sizing down as it is as opposed to using cups. Grams is just a lot easier to convert and work with. In addition to a food scale, you're going to need filtered water. I always keep a bottle of filtered water at room temperature. Too cold and your dough might rise too fast. Too cold and if the water's too cold, your dough might not rise as fast. If the water's too warm, it'll rise way fast. So room temperature is just the better option. Next, you're gonna need flour. There are different types of flours you can use for sourdough. I personally like to use bread flour because it has a higher protein content than regular all-purpose flour. Bread flour is always milled to a specific consistency of 12.7% protein, whereas regular or all-purpose flour has a little bit lower of a protein content. The higher your protein content in your bread, the easier it is for your bread to work with, and it also affects how your loaf turns out. Because of the higher protein content, the gluten is also stronger and it retains the carbon dioxide more, which allows your bread to rise higher and keep its shape as opposed to falling flat while it's baking in the oven. But if you don't have bread flour, that is totally okay. You can just use regular all-purpose flours. Last few ingredients you're gonna need for baking bread is salt. And then for your boules, for dusting your boules, I like to use white rice flour. My label's a little bit rubbed off, but I use white rice flour. Not only to flour my bannetons here, but for also dusting the boules before I put them in the oven. One, it makes the design stand out. That is why I use white rice flour. Last but not least, your sourdough starter. There are a lot of people who are obsessed with feeding their starter every day and keeping the discard and cooking with it. But that's not exactly the best idea in the long run, especially if you're eating a high carb diet every day, because it's easy to overeat carbs if you're not being intuitive and intentional and having awareness in your diet. So I personally don't feed and discard every day. The difference between starter and discard is just unfed starter. If you feed your discard, the discard will then eat the new flour and rise up, and you will have starter. When the starter rises, once it's done eating, it will lower because there's no more food for the yeast to eat inside the starter, and then it will become discard. So all discard is inactive or sleeping starter, if that helps explain things a little bit. This starter is nice and bubbly and active. How I keep my starter is when I use my starter to cook or to bake with, after I'm done with that, I leave the little edges, like the remnants of flour that are around the edges of the jar and inside the jar. I leave those in there and just feed it with flour and water, and then I stick it back in the fridge. When it goes into the fridge, the yeast and the discard will still eat the new added flour and water, but at a much slower rate as opposed to room temperature. Whenever I'm ready to bake again, I will then take out my jar a few hours beforehand, set it on the counter, and let it wake up, let the yeast feed on the gluten. And when it's nice and bubbly and has doubled in size, I know that it's ready to go. All right, so making our first loaf of bread. We're gonna start out with our scale. Now, for my go-to recipe for boules is, for one boule is 500 grams of flour, 350 grams of water, 10 grams of salt, and then 100 to 150 grams of starter. Personally, I don't really measure out my starter. I just plop it in there because all it is water and flour that is active. You could make bread and only put 10 grams of starter in there, and it will still rise. Eventually, it will just take a much longer time because you have less yeast that is doing the work. If you make bread with 300 grams of starter, you're going to have a bit bigger loaf, of course, but it's also going to rise super fast because you have a lot of yeast, because you have a lot of active yeast going on. So, all right, so we're going to turn on our scale. We're going to hit the tare button so that it comes back to 0. Now, you can also double your recipes too. So if you want to make 2 loaves of bread, that's 1,000 grams of flour. See how easy it is to double your recipe from 500 to 100, 10 grams of salt to 20 grams of salt, 350 grams of flour to 350 grams of water to 700 grams water when the recipe is doubled. Now, they talk about hydration of loaves. This loaf, my recipe is 70% hydration, meaning that 70% of the recipe is water. And we know that it's 70% because at 1,000 grams of flour, 700 of those grams is water. So that's how you know your hydration. The higher hydration of dough, that's going to affect how dense or soft your bread turns out, and also affects working with it. If you are new to sourdough, I recommend starting at a lower percent of hydration, such as 65%. So if you had 1,000 grams of flour, I would do 650 grams of water. And then, of course, if you were to do 1 loaf of bread, you would just half that recipe. All right, so starting out, we're going to make 1 loaf of bread. So I have my 0. We're going to add 350 grams of water. And you can see there's 360 grams, so it's going to be a little bit more moist than I want it to be, but for the sake of this recipe, and I'm trying to stay consistent, I'm going to remove some water so that there's 350 grams there. Now, I know it doesn't look like much difference of water, or much difference when you take out that, 7 grams of water, but even if it was 50 grams, it still makes a difference. So, and for the sake of conversions, if you're a perfectionist, then yeah, make sure that it's exact. If you're a seasoned bread baker and you know what you're doing, and you're a little bit over under water, over under flour, and you don't really care about it, that's totally fine too. All right, now we're gonna add our starter, and I'm just gonna take this and dump it in. Another thing to remember with the starter is that the hydration of the starter matters too. Some people feed their starters in different ratios, and a different ratio or different hydration of starter can also affect the hydration of your dough. So I keep my starter at a hydration level of 100% so that it doesn't affect the hydration level of my bread. So that means I feed it equal parts flour and equal parts water. So I always feed my starter 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water. Some people feed them different ratios of 50 grams of flour and maybe 60 or 70 grams of water. And that could also gives you a different texture of starter. But again, this is totally to your own preference. If you like a thicker starter, I like a thicker starter with stronger gluten. Or if you like a thin starter where it just pours out kind of like a pancake mix. But that is totally up to you. All right, so we have our starter into our bowl of water, and we are going to mix it up. So the next thing you're going to add is salt. Now, salt is important to the creation of bread. Not only does it add flavor, but it also affects what the yeast is doing. Adding salt slows down the fermentation or the activity of the yeast. If you were to make bread without salt, it would rise very quickly. But what salt does is it slows down the yeast activity. Some people prefer to add it after mixing in the flour so that flour has time to soak up the water first. Or you could even add the salt in with your milky sourdough starter mixture. And it doesn't really have any effect at all on how your bread turns out. Some people do it first, so that way the salt is incorporated with the liquid. And others do it afterwards because they prefer the flour to be soaked up in the liquid. It doesn't really matter. I've done it both ways and I haven't really noticed the difference, but you do need to add salt to your bread at some point because that's going to affect yeast activity, the color of the crust, and the texture or crumb of your bread. So I like to add it here in the step before the flour because some people forget to add salt. So that's why I do it first. All right, so I'm going to make sure my scale is on. And you can't see it, but I'm going to, because it's under here, but you can kind of see it a little bit. But I'm going to be adding 10 grams of salt. And I use fine grain, pink Himalayan salt, but any kind of the salt works, really, honestly. So it's 3, 9, 10. All right, now we have salt. And I'm going to mix it up so that it is well incorporated and in with the liquid. you will notice, see, if you try not to stir around too much, but the salt kind of makes the dough stick to the stainless steel, which is fine. It's normal. It's going to happen. Sugar does that too when you add sugar to bread. So when I add sugar to my doughs, I usually add it after the flour, especially if I'm mixing by hand like this, just because I don't like the stickiness. But it's really up to you. I mean, it still came off. It just irks me a little bit. But you can see it's already affecting the gluten strands in your dough. All right, so next you're going to add flour, and we're going to add 500 grams of bread flour. All right, so there's exactly 500 grams of bread flour in here. Now we don't need our scale anymore. So we're done measuring out ingredients, so we can remove that. And we're going to take this and mix it up. You can use a stand mixer if you want, or mix by hand. The preference is totally up to you. I used to make bread by hand. It's just a really sticky process, and I'm not a fan of doing that. And some people even mix this up with their hands instead of a dough whisk or a pastry scraper. If you like to make things by hand and get your hands wet and feel the texture of your bread, that's totally fine. If not, use a pastry scraper or a pastry knife, or use your dough whisk. You can also use a stand mixer. That's totally fine too. Personally, that's what I do. All in my normal bread baking routine is I use my stand mixers because I have kids and I can't exactly get my hands dirty, and then it'll suddenly need me and then I have to clean my hands. Also, it's just a lot faster. Whereas this, you have to make sure you get all your flour bits incorporated and moist, which is a bit difficult to do, but you will get there. So you just spend a little bit of time just really working the flour in there and getting it moist. I'm going to probably use my hands for some of this so that I can, because that's the only thing with this, it's not really the best maneuvering dough. So I'm going to use my hands for some of this. I would show you the stand mixer, but it's pretty self-explanatory. It just does all the dirty and long work for you. Anyway, this is almost pretty much well incorporated. Once you get all your flour rolled up into a ball, then you're going to let it sit and soak it. You're going to let the water soak into the gluten, or the gluten soak up the water. And this time is called autolyzation, and there's another phrase called fermentalization. And the only difference between those two is when you add in salt. So right now it's autolyzing because I already added salt. If you haven't added salt yet, it's fermentalizing because it's just flour and water, as if you were adding flour and water to a starter and you were just letting your starter ferment. Autolyzing is with added salt. Notice this dough got a little bit, like it was looking a little bit dry, and now it's more sticky and moist. Alright, so I'm just really scraping the sides and bottom of the bowl to make sure I have all the flour incorporated. And then we're going to let that sit and autolyze or fermentalize, depending on which steps you're doing, for about 30 minutes and sometimes even up to 2 hours. The really great thing about sourdough is you can let this work on your schedule. So you can let this soak for as long as you need to within a 30-minute to 2-hour window. So you can run to shower, do errands, whatever it is you need to do, as long as you bear in mind you have some dough sitting on the counter that is soaking up flour, and we'll be needing some stretch and fold very soon. See the stickiness? I know this, and this is why I don't use my hands a lot. But if you like making things by hand, go do so. If you have a stand mixer and you're not filming like I am, use your stand mixer. That's another thing when you go wash your hands. If you don't scrape off all the dough off your hands, you then lose some mass from your bread. Anyways, so now that this is ready, I'm going to clean my hands and then we're going to cover this up. You can cover it up with a stretch tape or plastic wrap. If you don't have any of that in your house, You can also use a damp towel as well. Personally, I like to use Stretch Tight or Saran Wrap if I have it on hand, because I prefer it because I can see my dough better. But I don't have it at the time, so I'm just going to be using a damp cotton towel. I do a regular cotton one because of the clean fibers in the cotton. But as long as it's a cotton or even a linen towel as well. But it's damp so that your dough doesn't dry out. And then this one's just pretty. All right, so now we're going to let that sit, oddalize or fermentalize for 30 minutes. Then we're going to come back and do some stretch and folds. While this is sitting, while you're like putting everything away, you cannot forget to feed your starter. So we're going to take back our scale, set it back to 0, take our starter jar, and you can clean out this jar as much as you need to. I refresh my jars once a month, and all I do is I take out maybe a tablespoon of starter and I put it into a starter or a discard. And then I put it into a clean jar. I clean this one, and then I just take my new clean jar and feed it with flour and water. But this is looking... Actually, we can probably do that. Let's just do that. So I'm going to take a tablespoon, and I'm going to take a new jar. All right, so I have my new jar. Hit 0. We're going to add some discard or starter to it. And then I'm just going to toss this jar in the sink so that we can clean it out. But all I'm doing is scooping out some discard. You can even grab like a little bit as long as you have some yeast or some bacteria colony on the tip of your spoon and it's fed with new food. It can do its work and multiply and grow. So we're going to add that to my jar. Let's add just a little bit right here. Great. So now that that's in, I'm going to put this in the sink. And now I'm going to feed it with equal parts flour and water. Many people have a ratio of flour, water, and starter that they like to feed. For me personally, as long as I have some remnants of a living colony from my starter, I don't really need a ratio or I don't really need to include the starter in my ratio. So I have my starter, but I am going to feed it equal parts flour and water. I always feed my starter 60 to 70 grams of flour because most recipes call for around 100 grams of starter. Whatever amount of flour you feed your starter with is going to double. So if you feed your starter 20 grams of flour, it's going to double into 40 grams of starter. I'm going to feed my starter 60 to 70 grams of flour, and it's going to double into 120 to 140 grams of starter. Most recipes call for around 100 grams of starter. So once I use up those 100 grams, I then have at least 10 to 20 grams of starter left over that I can just refeed again for my next recipe. All right, and that's a very minimal, waste-free way of taking care and keeping a starter. All right, so we have 60 grams, around 60-ish grams of flour. You can also feed your starter bread flour or all-purpose flour. Doesn't really matter, but just bear in mind that with a higher protein content of bread flour is going to affect the texture and livelihood of your starter and gluten of your starter. So now we have 60-ish grams of flour. We're going to reset the scale and add equal parts of water. Okay. And now we're just going to mix it around. People keep their starters in all kinds of jars. Some seal it up tight, nice and tight. Others don't because they want their colony to breathe. Personally, I just set my lid on top of my jar and I don't screw it shut. That's all I do is I just set it on top. Stick it back in the fridge or have it ready for the next time I'm going to do some baking. All right, so once that is mixed up, make sure all the flour is incorporated well. There's no dry bits left. Then this is fed. I'm going to put it in the fridge to go into a dormant, slow eating state. All right, and then the next time I need starter, or when I plan on baking bread, I just make sure I take out my starter about 4 hours beforehand or even the night before. Your starter is usually active at its peak and ready to go within the first 4 to 12 hours after feeding. And that also depends on how warm your house is and how often you bake in your house. I bake in my house a lot. So my house is colonized, I should say. So that's the right word, with yeast in the air. So that also makes my starter feed faster. All right. There's my starter. It's fed. It's going to go in the fridge. And you can keep this in the fridge for weeks, months even. As long as you have a nice healthy starter. I've never had a starter mold on me or go bad. And the most I've gone without feeding it, using it, well, I want to say is about a month. So, all right, some things you will need for baking your sourdough when it's ready to bake. There are a couple ways you can bake your sourdough boule. One is is in a Dutch oven. A cast iron one. This is an enameled cast iron one, but a Dutch oven is necessary because what it's going to do, one, is going to evenly heat and cook the bread, but it's also going to trap moisture inside and allowing the bread to have nice rise as well. So you can use a Dutch oven. Make sure it is oven safe up to 450, 500 degrees because you're going to bake your bread at a very high temperature of 450. To line your Dutch oven, I used to use, and I really recommend using, parchment paper, and you just literally pull out a square, put your loaf on there, score it, and then you can use the edges of the square as a handle and drop it into your Dutch oven. If you do a lot of baking and you don't want to keep buying parchment paper, the other thing you can get is a silicone bread sling that is also oven safe. And same concept, you put your loaf of bread in the center there, score it, pick it up with the handles, drop it into your Dutch oven. Obviously and it would just look like this. And then when your bread is done, you can just pick it up out of your Dutch oven like so. And your bread does not stick. So some people, and another thing when you're baking is you're going to want to preheat your Dutch oven in the oven. Well, you can't just put the cold Dutch oven into a hot oven. You're going to want to preheat it while it's in the oven so that your bread has a hot oven to go into. When your bread goes into the Dutch oven, it's going to stick a little bit, so try not to move it around. If it does get somewhat stuck, give it a couple minutes for it to develop a crust, and then you can shake it a little bit to center your bread if you need to. And of course, with the Dutch oven, those go for your round circular boules. If you're not using a round circular boule and you're going to use an oval one, I recommend getting an oval pan. I don't have an oval Dutch oven, and they are wildly expensive, but I do have this roasting pan, super light, but it does exactly what I need it to do. It holds my bread. I use parchment paper, so I put my bread in parchment paper and then I drop it in here, and then I just seal it. And because it does what it needs to do, which is entrap the steam from your loaf and the moisture so that it rises while it's baking. And you do not have to preheat this in the oven. You can put this in cold or at room temperature. So you'd preheat your oven to 450 and then put your bread in this once it gets the temperature and just stick it in the ovens. There's no need to preheat this one in the oven. You do need to preheat your Dutch oven in the oven. All right. So our dough has been soaking up the flour and the water. So what we're going to start doing is stretch and folds. So the easiest way to do this is to get your hand wet. And what this process does is it starts giving the gluten strength and shape or something to hold on to. So the gluten right now is at rest because has been no movement or manipulation of it. What we're going to start doing is start shaping it into a ball. With traditional bread that's not sourdough or a lower hydration, normally you would just knead it, but because sourdough has such a high hydration level, you need to do stretch and folds. And there are many techniques. There's also slap and folds, and they also have coil folds. The version I'm going to show you is kind of a one-handed version of the stretch and fold. So I have here just a bowl of water. If I was standing next to the sink, I'd have my sink running a little bit, but all you're going to do is get your hands a little bit wet drop it a little bit, and then you're gonna cup around the dough, lift it up, stretch it a little bit, and bring it to the center. Rotate, cup your dough, lift it up a little bit, and bring it to the center. You're just gonna keep doing that around, let's say 20 folds, or until you start getting a ball-like shape. And this is just starting to give your dough some shape. If your hands start to get more sticky, get them wet in water, and this keeps the dough from sticking to your hands too much. You're gonna get a little bit of dough in your hands, but not as much as you would if you had dry hands. So you're gonna grab it with one hand and pull it over. Some people do two hands, so it would look like this. Do two hands, and they stretch their dough to almost the limit and bring it over. It doesn't matter which one you choose. Personally, I do one-handed because it's quicker for me, and I only get one hand dirty or wet. But if you like to handle your dough, you can do two hands. Just stretch, pull it over, like so. Notice it's already starting to have a shape a little bit. And you're starting to get that bowl, that ball-like shape that you want for your dough. Less rough and shaggy. It's starting to smooth out. This is only after a few stretch and folds. And you're going to do this in a 2-hour window every 15 minutes. Or at least as often as you remember. If you do it every 30 minutes, that's okay. And as long as you do it 4 times, that's the magic number. The more you do your stretch and folds, the tighter the gluten will become and more shape your dough will have. And the more easier it will be to handle and manage and shape after proofing. The less stretch and folds you do, the less shape and strength your gluten has, and it will be more difficult to manage and handle when shaping. So, this is an important process. There are some no-knead breads out there, but they do require a little bit different recipe as well, and the breads don't quite turn out like you want them to, or at least they don't quite turn out with the shape and ability to maneuver and manage like you want them to. The stretching and folding does is it strengthens the gluten and it gives you something to work with. Okay. As you do this, you can feel the dough start to tighten, so it feels less stretchy, like it's starting to pull against me a little bit. So this might be the last fold I'll do. So what I'll do is I fold it over, and then I pick up my ball and I turn it over on its seam a little bit just to kind of seal it on its side. And then I just leave it right there, and I cover it back up, and I will come back again and do this 3 more times every 15, 20, 30 minutes. All right, so now it's time for the second stretch and fold. See, the dough has kind of flattened out a little bit, but we're just gonna do the same thing, and I'm grabbing the edges and pulling it, stretching it up and pulling it over itself. And again, shaping it into that dough ball that we want. Look how nice and smooth and glossy the skin is starting to look, or your dough, I guess, is starting to look. That is a good sign. Obviously, if this was a higher hydration level, this might be a little bit stickier and maybe not as stretchy to work with. Also, if this was a lower protein dough, this would stretch a lot more because of the weaker gluten content. But because of the nice high protein content of the bread flour, this dough is nice, and the gluten in this dough here is nice and strong, so it's a lot more manageable. All right, that was stretch and fold 2, and we're going to come back in another 15 minutes and do it a third time. All right, so now it's time for the third stretch and fold. See, the dough has relaxed a little bit, so we're just going to do the same thing again. Notice the dough is much more glossier now, a lot easier to handle, not as sticky, and it's definitely like absorbs some of the flour on the sides of the bowl as well. That's what we want. Smooth and glossy. All right, and we have one more stretch and fold. I'm doing the same thing with my hands here. It's just kind of, instead of stretching it over and folding on itself, I'm just picking it up and turning the edge into the center and rotating it and then doing it again. Kind of similar to when I was doing the twist and turn of shaping, which I will show you after the proofing session. All right, one more stretch and fold to go. All right, we have stretched and folded this dough 4 times. I'm going to transfer it into a slightly smaller bowl because it doesn't need to hang out in this really giant one. And the only reason why I made the dough in this giant one was because this bowl was previously occupied. But it's empty now, so I'm just going to transfer this dough ball over. And what I'm going to do so that the dough doesn't stick to the bowl or to the saran wrap as it's rising is I'm going to just coat it in oil. So this keeps the dough sticking to the saran wrap. If you don't have saran wrap, you can use a cotton towel if you want. That's totally fine too. It does tend to stick a little bit to the cotton towels, but that's up to you if you don't want to use plastic. Anyways, I'm just coating the top of it, but I'm still going to turn it seam side down because I want the skin to stay on the outside. Just going to tuck it, the edges towards the middle again. And then I'm going to coat the ball with oil, just a little bit. You don't want to do too much. And all it does is it keeps it from sticking to this plastic wrap. So that's that. And then this is going to have its first proof. You can have it proof on the counter if you want. It's kind of baking within the next 2 hours or day or so. Sourdough is typically kind of a full day process if you don't do the long cold fermentation in the fridge. But I let this proof in the fridge so that I can bake it a couple of days later. So what it's going to do is going to have its first proof. After its first proof, then you're going to shape it. And then it's going to have its second cold proof or cold ferment. And that's usually 1 to 3 days. So the first rise will be on the counter. The second rise or cold ferment will be in the fridge. If you want to extend the time of the first ferment, you can put this in the fridge and just monitor it in the fridge till it's like doubled in size. Or you can let it proof on the counter. That usually takes, I want to say around 6 to 8 hours, depending on the temperature of your house, of course. But we're going to do this tomorrow, do the second shape tomorrow probably. So I'm going to cover this and put it in the fridge. Any normal day, if I had this prepped early in the morning, I would let it proof on the counter, second shape it in the afternoon or evening and stick it in the fridge that evening and then bake the next morning or a couple mornings later. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're going to cover up and stick her in the fridge. Off we go. Once you've completed your stretch and folds and your dough has proofed and risen, then you're going to want to shape it. So what we're going to do next is flour our counter. I wouldn't use too much, just like a light dusting amount like that. And then you would take your dough. See how it doesn't stick to the plastic because of the oil. It's so much nicer. If you didn't use oil, it would have stuck to the plastic and you would have been missing some dough. This is almost proofed a little too much, but it still works. You can still see a shape. There's still some jiggliness in there. Anyways, it's starting to spill over the edge of the bowl. I've had doughs where it did spill over the edge of the bowl onto the counter, but I was still able to shape it. So we're gonna take this here and we're gonna flip it over. Let gravity do its work, let it come out naturally on its own. Some people scrape the doughs out of the bowl. I like the satisfaction of watching it detach from the bowl on its own. A little mitt here. Turn the bowl a little bit so all the gluten falls, all the gluten strands fall. All right. All right. So here's your dough. You can kind of see the gluten strands in there a little bit. All these stringy stuff here, that looks really good. All right. If there's any little bits left in your bowl, you can scrape them out, add them to your dough. Now we're going to start shaping it. This is where your bench scraper is going to be a really handy tool. If your dough is really sticky, you can sprinkle flour around it and kind of use your bench scraper to like shove it under and like minimize the amount of stickiness. So you do this. If you have big bubbles like that, go ahead and pop them. But you don't want to pop all of the bubbles or every single bubble you see, because you need the dough to have some kind of rise. All right. So now we're just going to start taking the edges of the dough and start pulling it out to make a kind of a rectangle or square shape. Just very gently. Once it's in a somewhat rectangular shape, then you're going to take one side, fold it into thirds into the center, take the other side, fold it into thirds into the center. If you have any more big bubbles, go ahead and give them a pop. And then you're gonna, some people take this and they just roll it up. Some people fold it into thirds again. Doesn't matter how you do it. What you're trying to do is tighten the ball and give it shape. Then you can also take the edges, of course, if you want, and pull them in. But what I did here is I just fold it into thirds, and then I'm going to kind of take one corner or side of it and just roll it in onto each other on itself, turning it quarter turn, rolling it onto itself, quarter turn, rolling it onto itself, until all the edges of the circle are kind of tucked underneath. Pop any big bubbles that come out the course. And then you'll have a bit of flour. You can like rub it on top. Take your bench scraper. You can shape it like this, and all I'm doing in slow motion here is I'm kind of pushing whatever flour left on the counter under it, giving it a turn with the support of my hand, and a slight off push with the bench scraper. And what this is it's tightening the skin of your boule right here. So if you were imagine a plastic bag over this, and how if it was over a ball, and just, you know, if you wanted to tighten the bag, you would tighten the plastic part. That is what you're doing here. The ends of your dough are underneath right here, and you are tightening this and you are turning it, twisting the dough in a little ways, so you need to have the counter a little bit sticky. If it was all floured and just sliding around, this isn't gonna work. You need a little bit of stickiness on the counter to create tension. So you're gonna take how to shape it with your hands is you take it like this, you do a quarter turn, and as you do a quarter turn, you're pushing it away from you slightly, and then you're gonna pull it towards you a couple inches. And then you're gonna keep doing that, pull it towards you. Quarter turn, push, pull towards you. Quarter turn, push, pull it towards you. And then the more you do it, the more second nature will come. And if you look, the skin is starting to smooth out. You don't want to do this too much, or else you're going to start seeing tears in the skin. So only do it enough that the ball now has shape. And you're not done yet. So now this is going to sit on the counter, let the gluten relax and absorb into its new shape. And then you're going to shape it one more time and then put it into a banneton. All right, so I'm going to add a little bit of flour to the counter here. And it's going to bench rest for about 30 minutes. So, and then you pick it up with your hands. If it's a bit too sticky underneath, you use your bench scraper, scrape it up like this, and rest it. And while it bench rests, you're going to take a cotton towel and cover it so it doesn't dry out. Like so. All right, so it's been bench resting for a good 30 minutes. And so now we're just going to shape it again. So we're going to take our bench scraper and kind of push it like this and turn it over. And then we're just going to pull it. You don't have to pull it too tight because now it's kind of retained its circular shape or round ball-like shape. You don't want to pull it too tight because then you're going to tear the skin on the back. So we're just going to pull it out a little bit. And then there's another way, a few ways you can do this. You can do the thirds fold like you did the first time. You could also do this thing where you just pull all the sides to the center. Or there's also a triangular fold that some people do where they fold this in and then they just pull all the sides to the center. I like to do that with my oval loaves, but because this one's a circle one, I'm just gonna pull all the edges to the center. And again, creating that tension and in the ball, making it a nice tight round ball of dough. And continuing pulling the edges in until there's no more stickiness or nothing left to pull in. Once you've kind of got all the edges pulled in and you can't pull anymore, and the skin feels nice and tight on the side, you're gonna roll it over onto its seam, and again do that same turning and twisting, folding, or twisting and pulling motion, where you're again just tightening the ball skin towards you. And with this nice and tight skin, then it's going to go into the fridge and cold ferment or proof and you can do it up for 1 to 3 days. I do a max of 3 days because if it proofs too much, then the dough starts to lose its shape and you don't get as good of an ear when it's baking. It'll still turn out, it's just not ideal crust wise. So once this is nice and tight and formed into a good ball, we're going to get our banneton ready. So we have a banneton here. I'm going to leave the linen in on this one. I'm going to grab my rice flour and flour the banneton. And I'm just going to do a good heavy amount. This is pretty well seasoned and floured from past bakings, so I don't have to worry about it too much. And my dough's not very sticky, so I'm not really worried about it sticking. Anyways, so once that's floured, and you can definitely flour it more if this is really sticky, it's gonna go in the fridge and it's gonna kind of proof and ferment again. It'll grow a little bit depending on the temperature of your house and the temperature of your fridge and how long this was sitting on the counter, but it'll definitely grow a little bit. If you peek in at it 1 or 2 days and it's like huge and about to really expanded to like the edges of the bowl, I would hurry up and bake it because you don't want it to overproof because then the gluten doesn't have any more strength to it and it won't hold its shape while it's baking, and then you should just turn it into a flatter bread type of pastry, so like a focaccia or something like that, and you definitely don't have to throw it away. All right, so this is covered. We're going to cover it with a plastic covering. I have these stretchy plastic ones you can use. Some people just put it into a plastic bag. You just don't want it to dry out. And then I'm going to go stick this in the fridge. If you want to bake within the next few hours, within the next hour, you can definitely do that too. You're just not going to have a very good skin to cut or score on. So what I like to do is I actually put it in the freezer if I plan on baking within the next hour or so. I let it sit on the counter maybe for like 30 minutes to an hour, and then while the oven is preheating, I stick this in the freezer to kind of firm the skin a little bit so it's more easy to score. The bread still turns out and rises and bakes the same as if it were fermenting in the fridge for 1 to 3 days. All right, so let's cover this and stick her in the fridge. Okay, so this has been in the fridge for about 3 days. I'm going to uncover it and score it. It's been proofing quite nicely, let me say. So first we're going to do, I have my Dutch oven preheating in the oven at 450. It's been in there for almost an hour, I want to say. So the Dutch oven is nice and hot. It's still in the oven, but I will get it out after this. What I'm first going to do is score this. So what we're first going to do is score it. So if you have a bread sling, you can use this. If you have parchment paper, you can use that as well. Just place it over the bottom. You don't want to plop it out and risk flattening and losing out any air. So you're just going to put it over the top of this and gently turn it over like so. Pull it out. Let this sit on your counter somewhere to dry thoroughly before you put it away so that no moisture builds up in here and you don't risk getting any mold. So you let this dry thoroughly. Next, we're going to take our white rice flour, and this is purely for design purposes. If you don't have any white rice flour, you don't have to worry about dusting it. Your scores will still turn out. But the white rice flour really just helps the design and scoring stand out. All right. So here she is. Actually, I'm going to dust a little bit more. You can dust it as heavily or as lightly as you want, but the more flour, the more pronounced the design. All right, so first we're going to do a very simple one. There's tons of designs out there on the internet that you can find and go off of, but we're just going to do a very simple wheat and a big slash, or maybe actually we'll just do an X. So I'll just do a couple wheat designs on the sides. Now, when you're scoring, I went really fast here, but when you're scoring, all you're doing is poking through the skin of the loaf and gently dragging. You're not doing any kind of sawing motion. You're just piercing the skin with the tip of the razor and dragging. And that's all it is. Do not use like a sawing motion. You're just poking and dragging like so. Okay. We're going to try to do 4. So split down the middle, or we'll do like a cross in between these. So when you do designs, you do want to have at least 1 or 2 big slashes in the loaf to leave room for rise. You can do a lot of cutting intricate designs like this, but somewhere in your loaf, you need to have a 1 or 2 big slashes so that the loaf can rise and not burst through the seams anywhere else. So we're going to do this. Do 1 long slash like so. I'm going to stand on this side. I'm actually going to cut, instead of cutting from here and possibly ripping the skin, I'm going to cut from down here on the edge and bring it towards the center like this. Okay. I'm going to tighten this because it got loose. Okay, and then 1 more down here, and then we're going to bake her in the preheated Dutch oven. So here is our very simple scoring design. I'm going to set this off to the side a little bit, and I'm going to bring my Dutch oven over. All right, so I have here a very hot Dutch oven. You always use your gloves when handling this. Okay, so now we're going to drop our loaf of bread in there very carefully. If you have parchment paper, just grab it by the ends. With your bread sling, just grab it here. And gently lower her in. Simple as that. You can push these in down if you want to. Then we're going to cover her and we're going to bake her in the oven for 30 minutes with the lid on and then 15 minutes with the lid off. We'll just put her in. So you can't really see it because my oven glass is very dark. But my Dutch oven is sitting there cooking with the bread. Underneath the Dutch oven is a cookie sheet. If you can do 1 cookie sheet or 2 cookie sheets, but what that does, putting it below the Dutch oven, is it prevents excess heat from hitting the bottom of the loaf and getting a burnt bottom. So that can be a little tip you guys do. Have your Dutch oven on the top rack. And on the lower rack, have 1 to 2 cookie sheets to help reflect some of the heat so you don't burn the bottom of your loaf. Anyways, she's in the oven. I'm going to set a timer for 30 minutes. 30 minutes. And then after 30 minutes, we're going to take the lid off and bake her for 15 minutes. All right, so it has beeped. I turned the timer off, so I'm going to reach in real quick and take off the lid. So that looks amazing. We don't have to do anything, just take the lid off. And we're just going to bake it for 10 to 15 more minutes, depending on how dark you like the crust or how golden. You can go longer. I've done an extra 30 minutes and it got like a really dark brown, but it will still turn out. The crust might be a little bit harder. If you like it less golden, less brown. If you like it less golden, less brown, you can do like 10 minutes. But this last period here, because it's kind of pretty much done, just these last 10 to 15 minutes are just for the browning of the crust. All right, so she just came out of the oven. She looks amazing. As you can see, the design scores really stand out because of those the white flour that we put there. And the white flour is noticeable because it did not get absorbed by the dough. So what we're going to do is very carefully lift her out by these silicone handles. And we're going to place her on the wire rack. Just gonna leave the bread sling because we don't need that anymore. And now she's going to sit. Now, you don't want to initially cut into her until the first after 2 hours of cooling, because otherwise she's still going to be a little gummy, or you're going to get a gummy texture if you cut into her too soon. I mean, you totally can. It's up to you. We all like trying out fresh bread hot out of the oven, but I highly recommend, and I've always read that you need to at least wait 2 hours after she comes out of the oven, because she still has a little bit of cooking to do on the inside, and then once she's cooled down, then you won't have that gummy texture after you cut into her. Anyways, look at the crust. These big scores look amazing. Here's about how tall she is. These breads, I mean, they can get pretty tall, but it doesn't need to be too tall. These are great for French toast, sandwiches, whatever you like, or regular sourdough, or your regular, whatever you like to use your regular loaves of bread for, but with a little artisan touch. That makes sense. So here's what the bottom looks like. This is not burnt. She went a little bit long because she was in the oven for a couple minutes longer than I wanted, because I was trying to do some things with the kiddos, but this bottom is not burnt. So that is great. That's what we wanted. She's got a really nice, listen, like a crisp, like French feel to the crust. She sounds amazing. She smells amazing. So all you have to do is let her cool for a couple hours, and then you are free to cut into her. And that, my friends, is how you bake your very first loaf of food.